Herein then exists a host of further crimes, for the purported banking system purportedly invests what is not its property, which should instead only be retired from circulation, taking further from the pool of wealth without contributing to it, and without even rightfully establishing a right or authority to do so. But because the purported banking system never gave up lawful consideration, because therefore there is no purported debt to the bank, neither does the bank then risk loss of property, for the property at stake is not even the bank's, nor then is it the bank's to claim risk justifies interest. On the contrary, in the severe hypocrisy of their obfuscation of our promissory obligations to each other, the purported banking system in fact denies the real creditor any interest at all. Only the real creditor, who gives up property for another's promissory obligation, and only the obligor, who must fulfill the promissory obligation, have anything at all at stake. For the value of the representation or tokenization of our production, the value of what we call money, must remain consistent and fully dedicatable to its original purpose of representation, or either the real creditor or obligor, or both the real creditor and obligor, are denied their right to just reward by the obfuscation of the currency. In fact, then, both are denied just reward by the obfuscation of the currency, because the obfuscation inherently, irreversibly, and therefore terminally multiplies falsified indebtedness in proportion to remaining capacity to pay, until no reward at all is possible in the resultant inevitable terminal failure, a failure which, by the very nature of the obfuscation, is impossible to recover from. How does this happen? As a consequence of what I have explained is an implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation. First of all, then, what is a vital circulation? What do I mean by vital circulation? And what do I mean by an implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation? I mean exactly what these simple words mean. The implicit obligation, of course, is not declared, because it's the whole key to an unwarranted and even terminal system of dispossession. As I have said for over 43 years, no intelligent public in history has ever granted approval to such a system. It would be impossible for an intelligent public to do so, because just the implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation under such a system itself is terminal, because the only practical process by which we can do so perpetually multiplies falsified debt in proportion to a circulation or remaining capacity to pay. As a sum of falsified debt increases in proportion to a circulation, more and more and more of the circulation is inherently dedicated to servicing the perpetually escalating sum of falsified debt. We do not borrow more and more and more and more because no one understands the ramifications of borrowing excessively. On the contrary, we are forced to borrow more and more and more and more, because there is no other practical way to maintain a vital circulation, a circulation which, suffices to sustain the industry which can afford to service the escalating sum of debt. And so because if we fail to maintain a vital circulation, we can't even persist in servicing the existent falsified debts of the system of exploitation. Industrial prices are driven ever upward by interest, then, as the ever unjustifiable imposition of interest multiplies debt upon industry. Likewise, every market's ability to consume industrial production is impeded to an ever greater and eventually terminal degree by interest's unwarranted and unjustifiable multiplication of falsified indebtedness upon every market. Wherever we feel these ever-increasing restrictions upon our natural capacity to prosper, we are forced to borrow further, hoping only to survive against further multiplication of falsified indebtedness. Because we can only purportedly borrow money into circulation, or back into circulation then, so much as all the principal we pay out of circulation in servicing even the initial falsified debts of such a system is necessarily reborrowed as new debt equal to the former debt which we might otherwise presume to be resolved, making it mathematically impossible, therefore, to pay down the sum of debt. What interest we pay out of a circulation, however, counts none against the former sum of debt, and therefore, as we are forced to maintain a vital circulation by perpetually borrowing interest too back into circulation, as this creates just so much further debt, therefore the sum of debt inherently increases by so much as periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt. And of course, this process is irreversible so long as we merely maintain a vital circulation. Worse then, therefore, the sum of debt even inherently increases at an inherently escalating rate as ever greater sums of periodic interest are paid out of circulation against an ever greater sum of debt. This, of course, even forces the exploiters to reduce interest rates in the terminal stages of the finite lifespan of every such system, for persisting in former rates of interest when inevitably precipitate an immediate terminal failure. So we expire for failing to understand these things, which we cannot understand from the definition or description of this implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation as a Ponzi scheme. But so much as principal is never the rightful property of a bank, because the purported banking system never gives up lawful consideration, and so nor is interest justified then, because no property whatever of the bank is actually at risk. Thus in turn, it is not even possible for a purported banking system even to rightly earn principal from us in any further facet or time of its actual role, both because principal is only rightly retired from circulation, and because, as interest is not justified by any commensurable risk to the purported banking system whatever, there isn't even a justifiable way for the banking system to purportedly earn interest from us. Banks do not loan us money. They merely publish evidence of our promissory obligations to each other. Of course, we can do that ourselves at no such cost and at no such consequence. And so the huge lie that we call economy is terminal. It is not an economy at all. On the contrary, it is a falsification of indebtedness to a purported banking system which can only impose artificial, falsified costliness upon us, and which can only multiply initial, artificial, falsified costliness into inevitably terminal failure. The lie we call economy is the very antithesis of economy. No bigger lie could be told. The very systems before us have already done this before to the world. The purported Federal Reserve System, the very name of which is a lie, promised to solve the problems it on the contrary can only cause. No one ever has explained how it could possibly have solved the problems it can only cause, because it would be impossible to do so. It is impossible to do so because the only thing we can actually prove and have proven is that it can only multiply falsified indebtedness into terminal failure. We did not recover from the world's first Great Depression. It is impossible to actually recover from the terminal consequences of the present lie of economy, because an inevitably terminal sum of debt destroys our creditworthiness to borrow further. That is, it permanently destroys our creditworthiness to borrow further. And why? Once we suffer a sum of debt we can no longer afford to service, obviously we cannot afford to borrow further, as nonetheless remains incumbent upon us if we are to maintain a vital circulation against all the principal and interest we are paying out of a terminal circulation. In the end of the finite lifespan of every such system, owing to the truly phenomenal sums of falsified indebtedness which have been multiplied upon us at even an inherently escalated rate, we are paying tremendous sums of principal and interest out of circulation. Thus, having destroyed creditworthiness to borrow these phenomenal sums of principal and interest back into circulation, the circulation inherently deflates, issuing the coup de grace to industry and commerce. Lacking what I have rightly called a vital circulation, then, the system would practically immediately collapse. But there's no truly legitimate way for us to recover from the obfuscation of our promissory obligations, because we already suffer a terminal sum of debt, because we can only maintain a vital circulation by borrowing further beyond our means, and because the creditworthiness to borrow further is itself destroyed by the fact of exceeding already terminal sums of debt. This much is only what I've called a thesis of inevitable failure, which altogether, because the said process is the only practical means of maintaining a vital circulation. All this, therefore, is the general thrust of a mathematic proof that any purported economy subject to this obfuscation of our promissory obligations is inherently terminal. This lie of economy, then, can never be justified. But does eradicating interest itself solve all the issues imposed upon us by a lack of actual economy, then? Absolutely not. We've called this fact that falsified indebtedness is inherently multiplied in proportion to a circulation. We've called this maldisposition. What do we mean by this appropriate term? We mean that ever more of the circulation is wrongly dedicated to servicing the escalating sum of falsified indebtedness.